Okay, welcome. This is a WorldOregon webinar. My name is Tim DeRoche. I am the Director of Programs here at Oregon. I want to welcome you to this webinar. As a note, as with all of our webinars, if you have questions during the program, put them into the Q&A function on your screen. Listen and come up with them during the talk, put them in there anytime, and we will get to them at some point during the program. Very, very excited to have Emma Ashford with us today. She is with the Stimson Center, also an adjunct at Georgetown, and a regular columnist with Foreign Policy Magazine. I'll give a proper intro in just a moment. I want to talk about a few things we have coming up. Mainly the next big public program we have coming in June 11th at the Old Church here in Portland. If you are in the region, we have General James Mattis, the former Defense Secretary, who will be speaking on call sign chaos, leadership, and lifelong learning, and what is going on in the world at the moment. We are very, very happy to have him coming down from Washington for this event. We do have a couple other things coming up later in June. We will be announcing probably next week, both of them focusing on journalism in an age of disruption. They will all be at the Old Church. So stick around for that. I'm going to put a link in for the Mattis talk. We had a wonderful conversation with him. He is all geared to Portland. That brings us to today's program. We are very excited to have Emma Ashford, author of First Among Equals, U.S. Foreign Policy for a Multipolar World. I'm going to put a link to get the book from our dear friends at Broadway Books. And Emma is a senior fellow at the Stimson Center and is part of the Reimagining U.S. Grand Strategy Program. She is also an adjunct professor at the Georgetown University School of Foreign Service and a columnist at Foreign Policy. If you're a regular foreign policy reader like I am, probably enjoy seeing, as we were talking earlier, her often very pragmatic, contrarian views to a lot of what we read in the foreign policy press, and very refreshing, and I'm really excited that she could join us today. She has expertise in the politics of Russia, Europe, and the Middle East. She's the author of First Among Equals, as I mentioned, and also Oil, the State at War, the Foreign Policies of Petrostates, which was published by Georgetown in 2022. And just to kick things off, I'm going to turn the floor over to Emma, who will speak for a little bit, and then I will jump in with some moderated questions, and then I invite you all to submit your questions through Zoom, and we will get it all going. So Emma, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks. Thanks so much for the introduction, and to everyone that's here. I'm going to try and sort of introduce very briefly what I'm trying to do in the book, and then hopefully we can have more of an actual discussion about it. But I do actually want to open by giving you all a quote. And usually I would ask audiences to guess who said this, but since we're not interactive here, I'll tell you who said it. But the quote is, "It's not normal for the world to have a unipolar power. That was an anomaly. Eventually, you were going to reach back to the point where you had a multipolar world." And I have asked students and audiences and others when doing these book talks all across the country who said that quote. And some of the more common answers are Henry Kissinger, Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping. Almost nobody guessed who it actually was. And that was Marco Rubio, US Secretary of State, right after Donald Trump's inauguration. And I think the reason why this statement did not connect itself to Rubio is that it's very unusual, highly unusual, for a US Secretary of State to admit that perhaps the US is no longer the unipolar power. Perhaps we're no longer the indispensable nation. This is something that is very hard to imagine any previous Secretary of State in the last 30 or 40 years saying. But I also think it's accurate. So that's why I sort of like to start with this quote. The unipolar moment is over. And my book is all about how the US can try to figure out what's coming next and to adapt to it. The unipolar moment, though, just to back up for a second, was a period of really unprecedented US power and prestige that followed the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. And this is, again, historically just unprecedented. There have been almost no sort of great power competitions that ended with one power just collapsing and going away. There have been very few that ended with one power just standing above the rest with no one else that can really challenge them. And since 1991, what we've seen, therefore, is this real period of sort of American global predominance. The scholar Graham Allison described it as the whole world became America's sphere of influence. And the unipolar moment is thus relatively unique in sort of structural terms. It's also unique and relatively interesting in what US policymakers actually tried to do with that power and that freedom of maneuver during that period. We saw debates in the early 1990s. Now the Soviet Union was gone. People were like, well, what should the US do with its power, with its predominance? And they ended up settling on what some people would call liberal primacy, liberal internationalism, liberal hegemony. There's lots of different names for it. But in effect, a series of theories of how the US could transform the world and lock in its advantages over those 30 years. So whether that was expanding international institutions to create an enduring liberal order, whether that was expanding NATO to transform Europe, whether that was human rights, whether it was globalization, the notion that no two countries with McDonald's could ever go to war, so we would get peace through commerce, or even the Bush freedom agenda, right? That if we spread democracy, then the world would be safer for us all. There were all of these notions of how the US could lock in its predominance and come out of the unipolar moment better than ever off, or perhaps never come out of the unipolar moment at all. And so all of these notions have in common a very transformative, very assertive, revisionist approach to the world. The other thing they all have in common is that they basically failed, right? The US over the last 30 years has had some policy successes, some policy failures, but at a big picture level, we failed to transform the nature of international politics. We failed to lock in US advantages. The unipolar moment is ending and something else is emerging. And so that policy failure didn't cause where we are today, but it did certainly set the stage for it. So the US is entering this new period of international politics with some pretty heavy baggage, right? We have seen a bunch of foreign policy failures in recent years, from the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan to elsewhere, and now we're facing down this new international system. I argue in the book that what we're heading into is a period of unbalanced multipolarity, and that's a fancy IR word that effectively means there's going to be a couple of big states, the US and China, that are probably the most powerful states in the system, but there's also going to be multiple other states, these middle powers, that are going to also be very influential. So everything from Japan and South Korea to Germany to Russia to India, right? Middle powers, states that can influence things and shape the ways that the US and China influence the world in turn. There's been a very active academic debate that I'm not going to go into in any depth about whether we're headed into multipolarity or bipolarity, a US-China competition where they're the only important players. But from my point of view, I think the most important thing to take away is the world that we're entering looks remarkably more flexible than either the bipolar Cold War, where everything was very regimented and in blocks, the US versus the USSR, the communist world versus the free world, or the unipolar moment that came after it. What we're looking at going forward is a much more flexible world where states interact in a variety of different ways. That's not actually uncommon in history. It's actually probably more common in history writ large, but it is unusual for the last 70 or 80 years. So if we are entering a world that looks very different, then US policymakers need to start thinking about how US foreign policy adapts to it. And again, an argument that I make in the book that I've been making for a long time is US foreign policy as it has been construed is simply not capable of doing this, right? The policies that we pursued during the unipolar moment, which really relied on this notion that the US didn't have any competitors, that we could sort of do what we wanted, that's not the case anymore. Our current policies aren't going to suffice. But as the world changes, we need to figure out how we actually achieve US interests. And I think, moving from one world to the other is very challenging for US policymakers, even just psychologically, right? When you have been top dog for 30 years, the notion that maybe you might have to figure out how to work in a cooperative way with other states to try and balance against other states, that can be quite challenging. And so what we've seen across the last couple of administrations, and certainly since 2016, is different administrations, different presidents trying to adapt US foreign policy to this emerging reality, to this new world. I will also say I don't think any of these presidents have been particularly effective in doing so. Barack Obama promised to end the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. He promised to pivot the US towards Asia. He didn't succeed in doing any of that. The first Trump administration was supposed to change the terms in which we talked about US foreign policy, but really did not succeed in doing so. The Biden administration really leaned into this idea of a global alliance of democracies against an axis of autocracies in China and Russia and elsewhere. They were only moderately successful in doing so. And now what we're seeing in the second Trump administration is sort of a very naked, coercive approach where the US is using all the power and resources it built up during the unipolar moment against allies and adversaries alike. The argument that I make in the back half of the book is that I don't think any of these approaches are going to be particularly successful. And I think instead the US should pursue a strategy for multipolarity that is non-transformative, that is much more realist in orientation, that tries to work with the world as it is, not the world as we want it to be. This is not a new tradition in US foreign policy. It has a long history. You can look at Nixon and Kissinger, you can look at Eisenhower, you can look at George H.W. Bush, or even George Washington, right? They've all had realist elements in their foreign policy. If we were to pursue this in practice, though, in the coming decades, we would have to start doing a couple of things, and I'll just give you sort of 4 big points here. The US would have to conceive of our interests more narrowly, right? So we'd have to think in national interests instead of what's good for the world. We'd have to start to prioritize threats, right? If we no longer have the resources to do everything everywhere, then we have to start to think about what the biggest threats to the United States are, to our way of life, to our prosperity, and we have to counter those threats, not the ones that are more tangential. Policymakers are going to need to think more carefully about crisis flashpoints, right? Those places where we might end up sliding into a great power war because of competition, whether that's Ukraine, whether that's Taiwan or elsewhere. And then the final point is that I believe policymakers really do need to rethink America's sprawling network of alliances and dependence. We need our alliances to be more alliances of equals rather than ones in which the US just provides defense for other states without providing anything in return. This is going to look a lot more flexible, ideally. It's going to look a lot more equal, for example, the transatlantic relationship. In practice, when you put these points together, you end up with a foreign policy that would step back, pull the US back to some extent from Europe and the Middle East, but lean in pretty aggressively on Asia, particularly in the economic space. So I won't spend too much more time talking about this, but I will just say that the gist of my book is, in effect, that during the unipolar moment, the US policymakers were tempted by this idea that they really could reshape the world for the better. And that's a very appealing notion. But now that we see the world is changing, multipolarity is emerging, China's rising, we no longer have the scope to actually engage in this kind of transformative policy, and we risk overextending ourselves if we try to do so. And so the strategy that I propose in the book, and I'm happy to talk a lot more about here, is trying to bring our means and ends back into alignment a little bit better so that we can embrace the opportunities a multipolar world actually offers us. And I don't think we're going to be worse off as a result. I think there's plenty of ways for Americans to thrive and survive in this new world. We're just going to need to adapt to do that well. So I will stop there and come back to you, Tim.
Great. Oops. Okay. Thank you, Emma. So there's a lot to unpack in the book, and I do find it interesting that the book hit the streets last fall, and you began writing this during the Biden era, or even during the previous Trump administration.
Biden, but yes.
Um, And a lot of what you talk about in the book, you propose, a dialing down of U.S. commitments in Europe and the Middle East and prioritizing Asia and Latin America and really reframing our economic engagement with the world. And in many ways, a lot of this is happening currently, but probably not the way in which you thought it might roll out. And I'm curious, if you were writing this book today, would it be, would you have focused on the realism differently? And are there things that you would have included?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I will say, I wrote this for the most part during the last sort of year and a bit of Biden, but he dropped out of the race right after I submitted the manuscript, throwing us into sort of this new presidential campaign, this new debate. And I asked my publishers, I said, can we add like just a foreword so we can talk a little bit about the first 6 months of Trump and whatever? And they said, okay, great. Yeah, you can sum up the last year and a half in 600 words. That sounds like plenty to cover 2025 and 2026. So obviously I didn't do that. But I think the themes of the book and the notion that we're in this period of real foreign policy ferment, I don't think that's changed at all. If anything, the second election of Donald Trump, I think, has emphasized some of the factors that I was talking about in the book, even when it was written originally. And that's the notion that Americans are fundamentally pretty unhappy with what foreign policy has done for them over the last few decades, that there are all these challenges in the world that we don't necessarily have good foreign policy answers for. And I think perhaps most importantly, the fact that no administration really has managed to turn the ship on this question, right? The Biden administration came into office promising that they were going to change things. And that only lasted about a year before they sort of flipped back to US foreign policy the way it had been for 30 years. And so I think there's a lot of continuity across even the last decade in just the debates that we are having about foreign policy. You did ask what else I would put in. I think the one area where the administration has been kind of absolutely fascinating that I would not have guessed is the Western Hemisphere, which barely figures in this book at all. But from the point of view of if you were looking for a US strategy that could preserve many of the gains that we've made in things like trade or globalization, while making us somewhat more secure, not worrying about supply chains, right? A Latin America strategy actually makes a lot of sense. And so I wish I had dug into that a little bit more. But on the current administration, I mean, look, I think my verdict is, right, they are doing some of the things I recommend in this book, and that is great. They're not necessarily doing them in the way that I would recommend. And then there are other areas where they're completely at odds. And I think this fits with, again, a complicated period of foreign policy debate. When you write a book like this, it's all one program, but in reality, administrations do bits here and bits there, and we get a very messy process of change.
Well, especially with regard to Latin America, and I mean, I guess we can think about Latin America and Greenland in the same moment when we talk about Western Hemisphere. Um, your foreign policy colleague Stephen Walt has written a lot about this, and the notion that we've sort of moved from being, the benevolent hegemon to the apex predator. And there's so much discussion, and I heard this a lot last fall when I was in DC of, are we moving towards spheres of influence? And we hear that, the Don Rowe doctrine. I mean, are these things that are cute uh, sound bites, or is there real policy that is driving some of this?
I think I would probably consider these to be two somewhat different things. So the first is that I think, Steve Walt has written pretty eloquently on this and others have as well. It's not that the US has always been a benevolent hegemon, right? We've always had that underlying threat force there. We've used sanctions and export controls on US allies. We've coerced them. We've certainly used them against US adversaries. But what we've seen in the Trump administration is that, the sort of the glove is off, right? Now we are just using our tools of coercion against everybody. We don't really care what the long-term results are. And Steve Walt calls this predatory hegemony. And I think that's actually a pretty good description for it. So what's changed is not that we did this a bit before, now we do it constantly. And that is a problem. problem. In terms of spheres of influence, though, and I think, again, this is where the Western Hemisphere question becomes quite interesting. I actually think spheres of influence are an inevitable part of the world returning towards a more multipolar system. We have this notion in our heads that a sphere of influence is something like what Churchill and Stalin and Roosevelt negotiated at Yalta, right? That they were going to divide up Europe on a map and we're going to give everybody percentages and we're going to sell some small countries down the river just so we can all live in peace. That's a very sort of normative, historically contingent version of spheres of influence. Mostly what spheres of influence are is the great powers sort of negotiating and deciding among themselves and saying, well, I don't really want to fight in that area. That's pretty close to your borders. I don't think it's worth my time to fight over, Afghanistan being one very historical example, right? The Russians and the British in the 19th century, debating whether they're going to fight over Afghanistan. And so I think as we see the rise of states like China, we are necessarily going to see the reemergence of something like spheres of influence, but it's not going to be some formal deal. It's going to be a realization on both parts that there are places where maybe the Chinese don't want us meddling, and there's places where we don't want them meddling.
So you recently wrote a really great piece, and I think when you and I were talking leading up to this event, you wrote a great article on the transatlantic relationship and how a better transatlantic relationship is possible. And I'm wondering if you can talk about that a little bit, sort of what your ideas are. Also, I remember in the article you hit on, I think, three doomsday scenarios which dominate a lot of that discourse.
Yeah, I mean, this is actually one of those areas, the transatlantic relationship, where between writing this book and, it coming out, when I wrote the chapter on transatlantic relations, what I was suggesting was utterly radical. The notion that the US over a period of 10 to 15 years would slowly decouple from European security and turn that over to Europeans. That was radical. By the time the book came out, the Trump administration had already moved past that and was actually pushing burden shifting on a faster timescale. So this is one of those areas where the Overton window has shifted really dramatically in a very short period of time. I do believe that a better transatlantic relationship is possible. And the reason I'm saying this is not because I think, we have nothing in common with Europe. We have no shared interests. We should just cut the cord and get a divorce now. I'm saying this in part because I actually think it's very important to have a good transatlantic relationship. And I don't see, and I argued this both in the book and I would still argue it today, I don't see how long term you have a good transatlantic relationship when the American taxpayer and the American military is basically doing all the work for Europe. And Europe is, as populous as the United States, as rich as the United States. If we don't find a way to make that a more equal relationship and to focus on other things that tie us together, like trade or culture or technology, then eventually that relationship is going to really sour. And I think, the problem with the paradox that we're seeing with Donald Trump is his very erratic behavior, pushing burden shifting. European states are, for the first time in reality, actually reconsidering this and moving towards building more defensive capabilities. And I think that's very good for this relationship in the long run. But the other things that Donald Trump is doing, the threatening to invade Greenland, the insulting European states, that's making it a more hostile relationship and maybe making it worse in the long run. So there's a real sort of tension here between the two ways the administration's approaching this.
So, a question from audience member is what is the role? So, in your framework, what is the role for multilateral organizations? And I'm thinking about Bretton Woods institutions like IMF and World Bank, and we keep hearing that the UN may close their doors. Where do these things lie in your framework?
Yeah, so I am a good realist in the international relations sense. And that means I think states are the primary actors in global affairs. That doesn't mean that international institutions, multilateral institutions are worthless or that they don't matter at all. But it does mean that I tend to think of things like the United Nations or the World Health Organization or these institutions, they're places for states to come together, to facilitate cooperation, to hash out their differences, to find ways to resolve their problems or coordinate. They're not things that have, it's not international law where it's binding and there's a court somewhere that's going to force states to do something. I just don't believe that's the case. But multilateral institutions are really important because they serve this coordination function and they provide ways for states, even competitors, to talk about other important issues. And the problem with our current set of multilateral institutions is that they no longer reflect the global power balance. They are no longer necessarily useful entities. I think the UN Security Council is a wonderful example. It has just become gridlocked. No one can agree on anything. Depending on the issue, one side or the other vetoes everything, whether it's the US, the Russians, the Chinese. And it's not useful as a coordinating or facilitating institution anymore. So we either need to find a way to fix that or to build something new that performs that function. So I think that's a great question because I think we do need new institutions in this new era.
So in some ways, I mean, somebody could, reading a lot of your work, feel as though you're, maybe not explicitly defending an America First foreign policy, but focusing on some aspects of these shifts that we're seeing, especially within the international order. And I mean, there's no argument that, not everything works well, and it's really good and very healthy to look at it. But if you were crafting the next chapter of a restrained and responsible statecraft, what would that look like? And with everything going on, as you mentioned, picking fights and name calling with traditional allies and threatening tariffs and things like that, it makes it hard for the trust piece to move us forward. So can we still steer the station wagon in the direction of a restrained realism at this point?
Yeah, no, I mean, look, it's a good question. And I mean, again, I do not necessarily support everything this administration does. I certainly don't. But I think there is a reason why America first, a phrase that President Trump effectively dredged up from his memory in the middle of an interview in 2015, that had this historic resonance. I think there's a reason why it has stuck and why it has been a relatively popular foreign policy slogan. And that's because after 30 years of this, as I said, really transformative foreign policy that often focused on the needs of other states, the notion of a foreign policy that does something for Americans is quite popular. You can see the same impulse in there was a big project run out of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace after Hillary Clinton's lost campaign in 2016. This was run by Jake Sullivan, who ended up being Biden's national security advisor, and it was called Foreign Policy for the Middle Class. And the goal was for the Democratic Party to come up with a foreign policy that told Americans, like, hey, here's what foreign policy does for you. These are the same impulses. And for me, that notion that foreign policy should be in the national interest, I do think is very important and is something that we really have lost in recent years. Now, as to the question of whether what the current administration is doing has damaged this notion or has damaged the idea of a more realist foreign policy, I think there's good and bad to it, right? The administration, the president in particular, has proven remarkably capable of kind of smashing apart existing institutions and structures and ideas in ways that make the debate a lot more open, right? Again, to return to the transatlantic relationship as an example, you could not have possibly argued with a straight face 5 years ago that we would have European capitals openly talking about spending this much on defense, about building up their own defensive capabilities. That would just have seemed impossible. So the administration has really moved the ball forward in some of these ways. But as you say, the sort of erratic nature of the foreign policy, the fact that, it's not always well thought out, that it's not a coherent program across different issue areas, it's a very bumpy version of this. I think in some ways we will probably come out of this administration somewhat better off than we were before. But, again, there is the possibility that we end up creating damage as well, I think.
Well, in your book, if I recall, you had sort of four camps of ongoing foreign policy debates. And it seems to me that in some ways you cherry picking a little bit between, I think it was, liberal order folks, the America First people, realist, the realist camp, and the sort of nation building, world building piece. Do you still see that those are the camps that are driving conversation? And is there a better mashup for what a really good looking foreign policy could contain?
Yeah, so there's one chapter of the book basically where I try to sort of just look around DC, look around US foreign policy debates and say, well, what are people actually arguing, right? Let's just abandon whatever categories we had before and let's just say, what are people actually making arguments about? Are there any coherent worldviews? And as you say, I came up with sort of four, which is every political scientist loves a good two by two, right? So four schools of thought, too broadly in the Republican Party, too broadly in the Democratic Party. But split along key issues like, is this a national foreign policy on national interest grounds, or is this internationalist? And very hawkish, very dovish, things like that. So I think what we've seen in the current administration is that there are a mix of folks who fall into what I call the America First camp, which is a very hawkish but national interest focused group. We're seeing that in Iran, we saw that in Venezuela, very willing to use military force, but they're not really into the whole multilateralism thing. And then they're being countered in some ways by a more realist or restrained group inside the Trump administration who are still very conservative, who are still focused on the national interest, but who are less willing to use military force or more skeptical of what they can do with military force. Over on the Democratic side, we have kind of two visions for foreign policy that, again, I think are still broadly accurate. One is this extremely ambitious world building approach that we saw at the end of the Biden administration, right? That we're going to build a global alliance of democracies, that we're going to build, allied scale for industrial capabilities, and that we're going to do so on an international basis. And then you have the progressives on the other wing of the Democratic Party. Now, they're a lot more skeptical about the use of force. They're a lot more skeptical about military spending, but they're still very universalist in how they think about foreign policy, right? They want foreign policy for everybody, not just for Americans. They want to make the world safer for everyone. And so, to me, I actually do think those divisions still pretty much sum up the debate that we're having today. The main difference is that I think on the Republican side, I had assumed that the America First, that the hawks would really predominate, and what we've seen in the administration so far is actually more of a mix.
So, in addition to your work at the Stimson Center and writing for foreign policy, you were also an adjunct in Georgetown School of Foreign Service. And I'm very, very curious. We were talking a little bit before we began the program about what are the conversations that are happening with students when you just mentioned skeptics. I think some of my favorite conversations are with the young minds who look at the accepted wisdom of, decades of steps and missteps. So, what kinds of conversations are students having? Are they feeling um, inspired, engaged, disenfranchised from the overall prospect of U.S. foreign policy? They're at Georgetown. Hope they're part of they're part of the stew in some way. What are the conversations you're having with people?
Yeah, I mean, look, so I talked to a lot of students both through my affiliation at Georgetown, but also just in my general think tank work. And what I will say is, again, I think over the last even 10 years, right, we have seen a lot of active engagement from young folks on the foreign policy questions. But even more so, I think, reflected in some of the polling, you see a real just shift in attitude among those who are under about 35 or 40, right? So basically, sort of millennials and under tend to be much more skeptical of the use of military force. They tend to be much more concerned about sort of economic prospects for themselves, for their families, for their kids, whether there's going to be a job for them after college graduation. And they tend to be much more worried about things like what happened in Gaza, in the last year or so. They're much more wary about US alliances, but particularly about US alliances with states like Israel, where the human rights may not match up in practical terms. And, as I say, this is something that I hear in an anecdotal basis a lot from students, but you also see it borne out in polling of, generational polling is that baby boomers, older Americans, still very willing to sort of accept this notion that America is the indispensable nation, that we have to be out there doing everything. Younger folks want to be engaged with the world, but they're much more skeptical of the notion that we're going to change everything, that we're going to do it all by military force. And my hope would be that that skepticism, indeed, I see it even in the current administration, is already starting to bleed into policy as some of these younger folks actually start to make their voices heard in the policy space.
Well, and so many of the folks who are in the School of Foreign Service ostensibly must be interested in a career in diplomacy. And the future of diplomacy has certainly been on the discussion of where that's going has been on the table for, not just now, but in the previous Biden administration and the previous Trump administration. You wrote another great piece recently in Foreign Policy about, um, you know, diplomacy and some of the problems inherent in it. It's not a new thing. Um, we're also seeing a hollowed out diplomatic corps and seasoned foreign service folks stepping away. Um, are you hopeful about a new generation of people interested in peace building or diplomacy, or rolling up their sleeves?
Oh, I'm always hopeful about that. And I have to say, it's one of the most encouraging things is, especially if you want to get US foreign policy to a better place, or what I think of as a better place, there's always enthusiastic, eager young people who want to help to make US foreign policy better. And I think that's absolutely wonderful. What we've seen in this administration, I think, has been, again, a really mixed bag on the institutions of foreign policy and America's capability to do it. So the administration on the good side has been very open to the notion of talking even to US adversaries, right? They reopened conversations with Russia on Ukraine, on strategic stability and other questions. We have this trip to China, in fact, today and tomorrow, where the president, I think, is going to help to diffuse some of those tensions. And they seem very interested in reforming the institutions of US foreign policy. But at the same time, on the bad side, as you say, we've had sort of this extremely aggressive culling of US diplomatic capabilities, of USAID, the US Agency for International Development. The administration really very much wants to get rid of the old structures, but they're not really putting in that effort yet to build something new. They are recruiting younger folks, but it's probably not enough. And America has really lost a lot of capabilities. And so all of these big diplomatic endeavors that the Trump administration have been doing, they're mostly being done by folks like Steve Witkoff, the president's friend. And that's not good for US diplomacy in the long run. So something I really would like to see from this administration is just a little more institutionalization of that foreign policy. Otherwise, it's going to be pretty unsustainable.
So, as you just mentioned, the president just landed in China this morning for a summit, accompanied with tech leaders like Elon Musk and Jensen Huang of NVIDIA and Tim Cook. What do you think we can expect to see, given an era of vast uncertainty? What are we going to see come out of talks with Xi in China?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think the US-China relationship has been on a real roller coaster for the last 10 years. And in some ways, it was Donald Trump that was responsible for sending us off that first hill, right? His administration back in 2017 was the one that popularized the term great power competition and said that, we were moving towards competition with China. It was not going to be cooperation. Since that time, US-China relations have worsened and worsened and worsened. And I think one of the things I see the administration doing that's welcome here is that they are trying to bring that back up. Not that we're going to suddenly be great friends with China again, that we're going to cooperate on everything, but realization both in Washington and Beijing that we need to stabilize this relationship. We don't want to end up in some conflict over Taiwan. We want to find the places where we can cooperate. We don't need to couple our economies to be secure. And I think that's a huge step forward in and of itself. I'm not sure we're going to see massive deals announced from this trip, however. In many ways, they've been talking a lot about doing these summits regularly between Xi and Trump. And I think part of the hope here is genuinely just to reinitialize contacts between the sides, emphasize that we can have this relationship and sort of direct the bureaucracy in both countries to start working together more. And even if that was what we got, I think that probably would be a success. But I think again, the Trump administration may want bigger deals. I don't really think they're going to walk away with anything.
I want to remind folks in the audience, please, if you have a question for Emma Ashford, please put it in the Q&A function on your screen, and we will try and get to things. So Emma, last November when I was at the World Affairs Councils of America conference in DC, much of the conversation and the theme of the conference was the world on balance. And I would say to the letter, probably almost every session talked about, is this the end of the international rules-based order as we know it? And it was certainly kind of capped very dramatically by an effusive talk by Walter Russell Reed at the closing luncheon about, yes, it may be broken. We will never be going back to the status quo. And perhaps the sacred obligations we've often had for our allies have changed. Where do you stand with that?
Yeah, so I mean, look, anytime somebody brings up the liberal international order, the rules-based international order, it always puts me in mind of what Gandhi said about Western civilization. He said it would be a good idea. And I think the liberal international order sort of falls into that category, right? It's one of these comforting ideas that we tell ourselves about the world, that America has built this liberal order, that it is about sort of peace and harmony and human rights for all. And in practice, the historical record does not suggest that there really is such a thing, right? Maybe in Western Europe, that there was this notion of institutions, the EU, NATO, that moved us towards a more peaceful environment. But even the Cold War, right, was remarkably violent when you got outside of the European context. People in Vietnam, I do not believe, would think there was a liberal international order. And during the unipolar moment, we took what were sort of these institutions that we tried to build in Europe in the Cold War period, and we expanded them. We expanded NATO. We talked about human rights and the International Criminal Court and all of these things that we were going to start applying around the world. But again, this was always very contingent. It applied in some places and definitely not in others. And much of it was mostly about US power, right? And so if the US no longer has the power capabilities to try and actually enforce these ideas, or if our decisions about where and when they get enforced have changed so dramatically, then again, I don't think this is even a comforting falsehood that we can tell ourselves anymore. That doesn't mean US power is always bad. That doesn't mean we always do bad things in the world. It doesn't mean we can't make things better. But again, I think we're just kidding ourselves that there ever was such a thing as liberal order. It's always been a lot messier than that.
Well, so are we trading one notion of American exceptionalism for another?
It's funny. There is an amazing essay from The Atlantic back in about 2019, I believe, again, written by Jake Sullivan, about the notion that America needs to abandon American exceptionalism as the Bush administration suggested that it should be, right? America going out and helping the world to be more like us. And he called for America to adopt a more modest American exceptionalism, one that, accepts that we are an example to other countries, that we can act as a beacon for other countries, right? Very Ronald Reagan, shining city on a hill stuff. But I think it's absolutely fascinating that once Jake Sullivan sort of got into office, he very much changed. And we see in the Biden administration, they went back to this notion of American exceptionalism, American indispensable nationhood, right? That we are going to manage the world because, what was it Madeleine Albright said? We're the indispensable nation because we see further into the future than other nations. And so I really like that first version, that Jake Sullivan article version. But I think the Albright version, again, is a very comfortable falsehood. It's something that makes us feel great. but it's not actually a reflection of the impact that America has always had in the world. And it's certainly not something that I think we're necessarily capable of actually achieving in practice. So I am much more comfortable with a modest version of American exceptionalism.
So, a question from audience member, could you provide snapshot comments on what is next for Cuba, Venezuela, and Ukraine?
I wish I knew. I'd go out and polymarket and make a bunch of money like folks in the
Yeah.
Trump administration. No, look, I mean, I think what we've seen over the last few months is, in some ways, the inevitable result of an administration where, the person at the top has limited impulse control and a tendency to sort of use military force when he thinks it will be quick and effective and get out. And we saw in Venezuela that it mostly worked, actually. The seizure of Nicolas Maduro, his replacement with Delcy Rodriguez, very well choreographed, does not appear to have created chaos in Venezuela. If anything, it's opening up the Venezuelan economy. It's better for US interests. I'm still not sure it was a great idea, but it has worked. In the contrast, what we see in Iran is, the administration clearly thought this would be a quick surgical strike on Iran, that the regime would collapse or would capitulate, come to the table. And instead, here we are over 2 months later, the Strait of Hormuz is closed, the global economy is suffering, and the administration has no plan for how to get out of this, right? So two sides of the same coin. In one, they were right, they could do it quickly. In the other, they were completely wrong about it. What really worries me about Cuba is that they still seem to think that this is on the table, right? Even after the experiences in Iran, there does appear to be a consensus in the administration, or at least, let's say, a group within the administration that believes that Cuba could be done in the same way as Venezuela, quickly, effectively, better for US interests. And I'm just not sure that that's true. It's certainly not my area of expertise, but I am very skeptical of any notion that we can change things on the ground fundamentally in another state without some kind of unexpected consequence.
Right. Great. Thanks. We have another question from an audience member. In your book, which he says is terrific, by the way, you talk about the need for multilateralism in dealing with certain issues. In what ways do current international institutions need to change in dealing with a more multipolar world and countries like the US more narrowly pursuing their national interest?
Yeah, no, this is such a great question. Actually, it makes me realize I didn't answer your question about Bretton Woods earlier on the similar question. I mean, look, if we look at the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, they are not balanced with the current global economic distribution of wealth, in effect, right? So they still reflect voting shares as set up in pretty much the 1970s. They do not reflect the fact that China and India are major global economies. And this is, they do not have the same voting rights that their major Western European counterparts do. That's a significant problem, because if the institution does not actually reflect reality in terms of power, in terms of economic power, then at some point it's just going to become a meaningless institution and no one's going to rely on it. The IMF may persist longer because of its role as the lender of last resort, but I think with the Bretton Woods institutions, that's a real concern. But with almost all of these institutions, whether it's the Bretton Woods system, the UN more broadly, or whether it's things like our arms control infrastructure, the actual fundamental realities of power are not necessarily reflected in the structure of these institutions as they were set up, whether it was 70 years ago, 100 years ago, whatever. And I'll give you just one other example. The NPT, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which has five signatories, the P5, that's the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council who are nuclear powers. They are not the only nuclear powers. They have not been the only nuclear powers in many, many years. But the Indians and the Pakistanis developed nuclear weapons on the side. It was believed that they shouldn't be admitted to the NPT because it would legitimate their nuclear weapons. We now have the North Koreans, the Israelis have had nuclear weapons for a long time, and so on. And again, that organization no longer actually reflects the reality of what nuclear states, nuclear armed states need to discuss in terms of arms control, in terms of how we prevent further proliferation away from those states. And so that's one of those examples where that's an international treaty that not everyone's a party to, but we clearly need something updated, either in that institution or in a new institution if we're going to make it work long term.
Great. So you write often on the big kind of top of the fold issues that are shaping U.S. foreign policy, Iran, Venezuela, transatlantic dynamics, Ukraine. Are there emerging flashpoints or developments not getting the journalistic real estate or public discussion you think we should be looking at closer?
Yeah, no, this is a great question. I mean, look, I think the fundamental big flashpoints that we need to worry about are the ones that people know about. It is Ukraine, it is Taiwan. But I do think some other areas that deserve a little more attention are, we know about the Middle East in the context of the current war in Iran, etc. But there are there are sort of downstream impacts from this war and the dynamics around it that could end up creating serious problems long term. So if the Iranians were to proceed to actually creating a nuclear weapon, that would likely create a spiral of proliferation. The Saudis would probably get a weapon, the Emiratis would probably get a weapon. We'd end up with a nuclear Middle East. That's pretty dangerous. And so that concerns me a lot. The the other side of the equation, though, Israel has been extremely aggressive and forward-leaning in its foreign policy over the last few years, ever since October 7th, to the extent that they have destabilized several of their neighbors. They're actively engaged in this war in Iran to destabilize Iran. Now they're talking about Turkey as being next. And these fault lines, again, whether or not the US gets sucked in, and Israel that is at war with the entire Middle East and trying to actively destabilize its neighbors, that's not good for everyone's stability long term. So that's probably the other area where it's not that I think the Middle East is so necessarily important that the US has to be all in there. I really don't. But I am concerned that the dynamics that we're helping to feed them right now, the dynamics that may make this actually a more dangerous region.
Yeah, Mark Lynch actually was with us a month or so ago about his new book on
Yeah.
America's Middle East, and he talked about very, very similar topics, and which if you haven't read his book, I recommend it to anyone in the audience as well. I think it was one of the more exciting books I've read on the Middle East in a long time by someone who has spoken for us any number of times.
He's
But
probably the smartest person I know in the Middle East, really.
yeah,
Genuinely read it.
and it is one of those retrenched areas that we continually find ourselves in. And it's interesting to watch what is happening with this administration with regard to the Middle East. And will the story be any different this time? Is I think the question that a lot of people have.
Yeah. I mean, in some ways, the problem with US policy in the Middle East has been that for, 15 to 20 years at this point, we have been half in, half out. Now, if it were up to me, I believe that US policy, US interests are better served, frankly, by mostly pulling back from the Middle East. But here's one of the sort of the ironic things that I argue in the book, that the only serious US interest in the Middle East is protecting the free flow of oil through the Strait of Hormuz. And right now, the policies that we're pursuing are actively making that impossible. So our policies are being very counterproductive. And I actually think that US retrenchment from the region might actually help us in the long run with how that region becomes more stable.
So we're coming up on time. I think about this a lot because I've been with WorldOregon for 16 years, and you're very much in this world, looking at the complexity, the awfulness, the challenging nature of the world. What keeps you going? Where do you find your hope? What are you working on now, and what's your next project?
Yeah, well, let me give you two. So one I already mentioned, which is I think genuinely that there is a generational shift in how Americans are thinking about foreign policy. And I think the energy of many young folks and their determination to actually change what we're seeing to steer US foreign policy back into a sort of a more rational direction, that always gives me a lot of hope, even when things aren't necessarily panning out the way that I might hope. But the other thing is, I emphasize this in the book because I think it's genuinely true. There's a lot of fear about leaving the unipolar moment, about, entering some multipolar world. I think even this is behind some of these debates about, is this a bipolar Cold War with China, or is this something multipolar? I think we're afraid. We think the Cold War was pretty stable. We're afraid to go into a multipolar world. And I don't think that fear is warranted. I actually think that a multipolar world is going to be more complicated, yes, but I actually think in some ways it's going to be more interesting. There are so many just fascinating factors out there. There are interesting ways in which states interact. We're going to see new negotiators, new mediators, new neutral states that act as go-betweens between the great powers. We're going to see new sort of forms of interaction between the great powers. And for me, as an academic, I find that completely fascinating. And I really do think that a multipolar world is going to be something very different. And I want to see what that looks like, and help to figure out how the US can navigate it better.
Great. I want to thank our audience for tuning in. Emma Ashford, thanks for your time. Again, her book is First Among Nation, or First Among Equals, U.S. Foreign Policy in a Multipolar World. I'm going to put the link again. You can get it from Broadway Books. Highly recommended. Emma, would love to have you back sometime to talk with us again. And want to thank the audience again. Be well, stay safe, and make sure you keep reading the news and try not to pay too much attention to the noise. So thanks much. Have a great day, and we will see you soon.
Great. Thanks so much.